Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 18th of March. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, Putin's Syria surprise upsets permanent war agenda. And with a capital budget, there's plenty of money for infrastructure. So first, Putin's Syria surprise upsets permanent war agenda. And Craig, this week, everyone was taken by surprise. Nobody saw this coming. Vladimir Putin made an announcement at the beginning of the week. He said, "I feel that the objectives set before the Defence Ministry and the Russian armed forces in the Syrian Arabic Republic have generally been fulfilled." And that wasn't surprising. But then he said, "So I'm ordering the military to start bringing the troops back to Russia." Mm-hmm. And no one expected that. His announcement actually coincides with the beginning of the peace talks in Geneva, right? And the timing of that is quite important because those peace talks were made possible by the ceasefire that's in Syria, and the ceasefire that's in Syria was achieved by Putin's intervention.
Well, that's probably what we're used to these days is this permanent war agenda, as you've mentioned, and you expect these things to go on and on and on.
Drag on and on.
But really, the principle here that Putin's been fighting for, and the reason the troops have been fighting there, is to fight for the peace. And our problems have been these days, when we look at the West, you look at these interventions by Bush and by the West into Iraq and everywhere, there is actually no exit strategy for peace. There's no thought about fighting for the peace whatsoever because the intention is this permanent war, permanent revolution.
Exactly, and when you see the personnel in the US administration, in the British administrations that make these decisions, so many of them are tied into what they call the military-industrial complex, the arms companies who make money from war. So the longer the war drags out, the more money they make, right? Yeah. And that's certainly part of the equation as well. Russia's not taking that approach. Now, it's not disengaging. That's an important thing here. It's still there. It's only 4 hours flight time away, and Putin, I think today he reiterated, we can turn around and go back any time, right? But they're pulling out most of their forces, but not all of them by any means. And the strategic port it has in Syria, and the airport that Russia sort of operates from in Syria, it's going to keep its presence in those two places, right? Mm-hmm. So that sends a message to ISIS and its backers, hang on, don't think that, you're going to have it all your own way now. And in fact, Russia will continue, has already said it's going to continue its sorties against the ISIS forces.
Yeah, but I think it's also, the clear objective here, Robbie, is to allow the Syrian government, Bashar al-Assad, and his government, to work out the peace.
That's right.
To work it out with the opposition. It's a sovereign country. They have to work it out amongst themselves. So to the degree that Russia stays there with an enormous force and firepower, that hinders the process. And that's what Putin is very clearly saying. Look, we have to establish a durable peace here. The Geneva peace process is the important part of that. You've had the ceasefire. That's still holding. And a lot of people didn't think that would hold.
No.
But the point is that unless you fight for the peace and back it up, then you're not going to get peace.
Well, and this is what Putin said on the 11th of October, just after Russia did this intervention. He goes, quote, "Our task is to stabilise the legal government and create conditions for finding political compromise," end quote. So that's exactly what you just said.
Yep.
The Russia's attitude was, it's not our right as outsiders to decide who's going to be the government in Syria, but that government, whatever you think of it, is the legal government. You regime changes in America and Britain. You destroyed Iraq and created ISIS. You destroyed Libya and created this terrible ISIS situation there, plus this terrible flood of refugees. You've destroyed every place you've touched. You've destroyed. Now you want to destroy Syria. It's not going to happen on our watch, and that's what effectively they've done. Forget the specific details. The overarching accomplishment of Putin's intervention is he has stopped the regime change agenda in its tracks, because they said they would, and they have. There's a report in a publication called Russia Beyond the Headlines. Put it this way: it should be put on record that Moscow has managed to persuade the main power brokers, i.e. the United States, not to set as a precondition for a comprehensive settlement at its first stage the departure of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. And put another way, that is, Russia has stopped America's plans for regime change in this case. And then there's a Russian expert, Nikolai Pakamov, a political analyst and consultant in New York City and a Russian International Affairs Council expert. He wrote in the National Interest publication that Russia's actions in Syria, quote, have shown that it is effective to deal with states according to the international law rather than via slogans in editorial pages. In other words, the Treaty of Westphalia system, Craig, which puts the sovereignty of nations first, works. That's what Russia has shown, because its presence in Syria was at the invitation of the Syrian government.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I think this has really got an important principle to illustrate for what's taking place in the South China Sea, Robbie, because what we've seen is the militarisation of the South China Sea, not by China, but by the US. The same sort of thuggery that we've seen take place right around the world where they support these endless wars.
You issued a statement on that this week. People can find that on our website.
Yeah, that's why I'm sort of referring to it, because look, China has no intention for war. In fact, if you look at the sort of agreements and over the disputes it's had with its neighbouring countries, through the ASEAN grouping of countries, you know, the Southeast Asian nations, they've been able to find mutual solutions through various treaty agreements and so forth, through close dialogue.
They've resolved their differences in a mutual way.
Yeah, this is the Westphalian principle of sitting down and discussing differences, but looking at this question of the sovereignty of each nation, making sure that wherever possible each nation is satisfied and fairly treated in terms of a resolution. Now that's how you solve problems, but you don't go in there with battleship destroyer capabilities, aircraft carriers, to try and test the so-called freedom of navigation and provoke what could be World War III.
As your statement said, Craig, that the latest US freedom of navigation exercise in the South China Sea involved a fleet that had so much firepower it could blow up the world, right? And that's their reaction to China putting one surface-to-air missile installation on one island.
Yeah, I mean, and they've been there since the 50s, Robbie. It's not like this has just been taken over or somehow they're forcibly taken over. The point is that, you know, these islands have been under effective Chinese control and population for the last, since the 1950s.
And I think, Craig, it's worth saying also that the reason, go back to Russia for a second, the reason Russia is only 4 hours away from Syria is because Syria really is its backyard. It's not Britain's backyard or America's backyard, and certainly not our backyard. South China Sea is China's backyard. It's China's sea. Right,
and it's right a lot further away than 4 hours.
It's not ours, it's not America's, it's not Britain's, right?
Yeah.
Yet, see, that's the British for centuries have specialised in finding where there's been disputes and fanning those disputes, playing one side off against the other, divide and conquer. That's what their imperial power is based on, and unfortunately, the neocons in America have adopted that approach. That's got to end if the world's going to have peace.
I think also, look, what Putin's done, Robbie, is he's demonstrated very clearly this, what you said before about this Westphalian principle, which is the principle of recognising sovereign nation states, fighting for that sovereignty, and then looking for solutions which advantage each of the states involved. That's what Putin's actually demonstrated is alive and well. That is the principle of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, where there is a collaboration for the mutual development of each of those nation states, which is completely different to what you're looking with this idea of the British Empire, right, or the British Commonwealth, or the transatlantic system, or the EU, or whatever, where sovereignty is being suppressed for the benefit of a financial oligarchy.
Yeah, the government has only one purpose, which is to enforce the demands of this private financial elite who think they can loot the world. Craig, let's end it there, but just to remind viewers, you can get all the information we're talking about from the Australian Alert Service. So a lot of what we discussed was in this week's version, which you can call in and get a free copy of. And what we discuss in the next segment is also going to be from the Australian Alert Service. So when we come back, we're going to talk about how there's more than enough money in our economy to fund all the infrastructure we'd ever need.
You've been watching the CEC Report, the weekly TV show of the Citizens Electoral Council of Australia. What can people do to find out more, Robert?
Well, they can get on our website, www.cecaust.com.au, or they can call our toll-free number Lisa to order a copy of this, the Australian Alert Service, which is our weekly publication where we write up all the material we use. That number is 1800 636 432. Welcome back to the CEC Report. With a capital budget, there's plenty of money for infrastructure. So Australia has somewhere in the order of $700 to $800 billion infrastructure deficit, Craig, and that's based on calculating how much we should have spent but didn't.
I think that's very conservative.
Probably, I'm sure it is,
higher.
Especially if you have a vision of what our country could be. Like, someone like old timers like Malcolm Fraser, he thought we should have 50 million people. We think we can easily have 100 million people. The guy who built the Sydney Harbour Bridge, Dr. Bradfield, and designed the Bradfield scheme, he assumed in the 1940s, 30s, when he was building the Harbour Bridge, that by 1990 Australia would have 90 million people.
Well, so that's my.
And it was nothing to be afraid of. It was something to aspire to.
It's not actually a dollar question. If we solve the dollar question, what we find is that we're going to need many more refugees, immigration. We don't have enough people in this country, and people freak out about that idea. But when you look at actually building large-scale infrastructure development projects, you have to go back to the Snowy Mountain scheme and look at the numbers of the hundreds of thousands of people that we employed at that point in the post-World War II period as a necessary response to what was taking place with refugees in the world from, at that time, Eastern Europe and so forth. But the point is that right now we just don't have enough people.
And that lack of population density came up specifically this week on Sky News on Sunday on the agenda program. Anthony Albanese was being interviewed, and he promoted again the idea of a fast train from Melbourne to Brisbane. And I rolled my eyes, Craig, because this has been promoted since Paul Keating, and it's only ever been talked about. It's a tease, right, largely. However, he seemed slightly more intent on it. But the question immediately comes up is how practical is this project based on where do the dollars come from? But the practical side is also relates to, do we have the population density to warrant this? Well, it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, right? Because by building it, we'll be able to support the population density that warrants it, right? And it's something you've got to kickstart it. This project is as good as any. But okay, where do the dollars come from? Well, we're going to have a serious proposal in the next segment of this, but let's talk about dollars that are swimming around right now that don't have to be invented. And that is superannuation. So it turns out that billions of dollars of money that Australian workers are putting in super, but not putting in, they're being made to put in it, right? They've been made to lock it away in super. They can't touch it until they retire. And if it's in the stock market, they watch it go on this roller coaster, right? And every few years lose huge amounts of it. And they sort of get used to that now, like that's part of the system, which shouldn't be part of the system. But it's there. It's more than $2 trillion is now in super. But billions of dollars of that is being invested overseas. And the example I want to give is the union members whose retirement savings are being managed by the industry fund called Australian Super, which I believe is the biggest. Those members, whether they like it or not, they are now the majority owners of the King's Cross St Pancras Station redevelopment in London. And more than $1 billion of their money owns that. And the reason they own it is because the British government was paying for this, but under the Thatcherites that are now the British government, they're on a privatisation spree to balance their budget. And they sold it. They wanted to sell this. So who are the suckers they sold it to? These Australian union members, right, that now own this project. So you can see the project on the screen. This is going to be a great project. They're going to build 2,000 homes, and they're going to have offices and retail space and all this kind of stuff. And I've been to this station, Craig. You've been to this station when we went to our conference last year. This is where the Eurostar leaves, etc. And it's all wonderful. Apparently, it's a bit low rent in the sense that it's a bit of a crime area, etc. And what they wanted, sorry,
I was going to say it's publicly owned too.
That's right, but they want to bring it up to the high rent status of the rest of the London bubble is what they want to do. In other words, it's not actually creating anything. It's not improving the world, right? It's just going to give a facelift to this part of London, and that's what the super of Australian workers is invested in right now. That's crazy enough. The super that stays in Australia, that super funds claim they put in infrastructure, it turns out what they call infrastructure is actually privatised assets. So most of it's not building something new. It's when governments want to privatise things, the super funds come along and say, oh, we'll buy that. And Steve Bracks, the former Premier of Victoria here, is the chairman of CBUS. He's pushing this big time. He wants $90 billion worth of assets privatised. And then on top of that, you have, with all our money being sent overseas, you've got pension funds from overseas that are sending money into Australia to do what? To buy privatised assets. And so, for example, last year the Canadian pension funds put $25 billion into Australia to buy up privatised assets like the Transgrid for the New South Wales electricity grid. So that's the way the system is working at the moment. It's not what super was promised to be. So have a look. This is a 1990 election campaign ad by Bob Hawke, the Prime Minister. So the year before they'd introduced compulsory superannuation, so he's promoting it, and look what he says it's for. He's very clear on this. Look what he says it's for.
Because of our new policies, 8 out of 10 employees already get $15 a week paid into their own personal superannuation scheme by their employer. Now it doubles to $30 a week, saved for your retirement by your boss in schemes that cover ordinary workers and part-time workers for the first time. It's a savings scheme that will be good for you and good for your country. Superannuation is building a massive bank of savings for investment in Australia's export and other productive industries. Every dollar saved helps finance Australia's development without foreign debt. And our superannuation program for all workers means that when you retire, you will do so with dignity of financial security. That's the sensible direction for Australia to take.
Authorised by RHOG for the Australian Labor Party, Canberra.
So Craig, that was unequivocal. That's what it's for: investment in Australia, in Australian industries, productive industries, and in such a way we won't have foreign debt, right? Mm-hmm. Well, what's happened? It hasn't invested in Australia. Like I said, it's gone overseas. And foreign debt has skyrocketed. This month, Australia's net foreign debt broke $1 trillion, gross foreign debt $2 trillion. So gross foreign debt is as high as the total amount of money in super. In the next segment, Craig, we'll discuss this capital budget idea. But just with super, couldn't the government sell infrastructure bonds to these Australian super funds, which are guaranteed, so the people who invest in them, their money is fully secure, at say 5%, so that money is earmarked for infrastructure that transforms Australia?
It's been done before, Robbie. Go back to World War I, the Commonwealth Bank issued bonds, right? Who bought them? The people bought them. Yeah. And the population was absolutely tiny, but they had about, I think, 9 of these war bonds and peace bonds issued, raised all the money necessary to fund World War I at that time. Well, why not do the same thing? Yeah. They get, for the government to issue these bonds at a fixed interest rate. That'll be different than having your money in the stock market where it goes up and down, so you know what your returns are, and then use that money to pay off the foreign debt. So we're not paying, and the money's not leaving the country.
That's right.
Right? It costs $2 trillion in superannuation funds now. $1 trillion of that could be spent in issuing bonds to buy back that debt. Therefore, the money stays in the country and you can then issue the bonds for other development purposes, which we'll come to in the next segment.
All right, so we'll take a break. When we come back, we'll finish this discussion. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing, with a capital budget, there's plenty of money for infrastructure. And Craig, just before we continue, I want to paint a picture for the viewers who aren't here in Melbourne. As we speak, Melbourne is in gridlock, and it's been every day this week, and it's going to be every day for the next 1.5 years, because they're upgrading the Bolte Bridge and CityLink. That project's going to take that long to do. Now, CityLink, Craig, is a private toll road. So that when it was built, the investors didn't plan 3 to 4 decades ahead for expected demand and growth. They didn't want to do that. They built the bare minimum so they could start making maximum profits straight away. Now, forget 3 to 4 decades ahead, it's not even 2 decades old yet, but they're having to do this major upgrade that brings the whole city to a total standstill, right? And that's the nature of the way infrastructure is done now in this private system. So what was interesting though, because this is becoming a real issue, this week, the billionaire businessman who owns Westfield, Frank Lowy, he made a suggestion that he may not like to know this, but was a total echo of something that Lyndon LaRouche, the American economist we work with, proposed in 2007. Funding infrastructure separately from the annual budget through what's called a capital budget. And LaRouche's paper that he put this out in 2007 was called The Lost Art of the Capital Budget. So Craig, what's the principle of a capital budget?
Actually, Robbie, the principle is creativity. Now, to explain that, is that if you want to have an economy which is continually growing, you're reliant on the breakthroughs and the entrepreneurship of people, their creativity, right? Now, Frank Lowy, of course, knows about this because he's built an empire around shopping centres and so forth, and he sees the need to have long-term investment. Now, when you deal with a normal budget, it's usually on a year-by-year basis, and everything in the kitchen sink these days is thrown into the regular budget, and that's all your development projects, your capital works, building of infrastructure and so forth. What we need to have is a separate capital budget, a budget that is funded, we believe, by the Commonwealth National Credit Bank, our idea of a national bank, so that you can dedicate funding, credit actually, to long-term projects, 25 to 50 years.
Exactly. Because long-term projects, capital projects that have that kind of lifespan, it's insane to fund them out of something that's based on annual revenue flows, whereas you could borrow that money. We'll say the word borrow, but what we mean is borrow from yourself, from your own bank, right? But that credit can easily fund that without putting a burden on the weekly annual budget.
Central banks these days print billions of dollars in quantitative easing. We've seen that. You're taking that same principle, but through a national bank that's government owned, you create that credit and you spend it into infrastructure. And infrastructure acts like arteries for the economy. It sends the lifeblood of economic activity right throughout the country. Take, for example, Dubbo. If I was to try and get to Dubbo now, whether I drive it's 8 hours, whether I fly it's almost 8 hours, because it's a lot of mucking around to get to Dubbo. If you spent the money to build a high-speed train, a magnetic levitation train, you could be there within a couple of hours, maybe 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours, right?
Transforms the way the country works.
Yeah, because what happens is you open up the country. You'd have a number of stops along there. So a day trip from Dubbo to Melbourne, is that not out of the question? The shipment of goods between Dubbo and Melbourne is not out of the question. So you can literally open up the country through the use of that infrastructure. So the tyranny of distance is broken down. Now, Professor Lance Endersby, a professor that we work very closely with, who developed the idea of the Australian Ring Road, said we should have a high-speed rail network that circulates the country. Now, if that cost $100 billion to build, you'd fund it over 50 years. The thing, once it's built, is not going to disappear in 6 months.
Whereas the contrast, Craig, I'm just sorry about that, but when the last time a government did a feasibility study into a Melbourne to Brisbane railway, they said it would cost $108 billion and 50 years to build because it would be funded out of the annual budget.
Yeah, well, you take a capital budget, you'd fund that and then for the money in tranches. You won't spend all that money in 1 year. You'd employ companies that would do partnership deals with, or technology partnership deals with Chinese companies that have pioneered this. We'd be able to build a lot faster than 50 years, right? And the point is that as soon as that starts to open up, you're going to see the development of the inside of the country. Now, how do you measure that? Well, you measure it in the ability of farmers and manufacturers and so forth to go out into these regions, new cities that are developed because of that, and the amount of physical goods production that are actually allowed to be created because you've got this infrastructure in place. And see, that's the difference.
So if Anthony Albanese is pushing a fast train, but not pushing a national banking mechanism to fund it, in contrast to Jeremy Corbyn in the UK is pushing a big infrastructure spending program, but people's quantitative easing to do it, that's genuine. But if Anthony Albanese isn't doing the same thing here and going back to Labor's old policy, then it's all talk.
Exactly. And Robbie, this is not inflationary. At the end of the day, when you're increasing the net productivity of the economy, you're increasing the tax base and so forth. The point is, it is the way that we actually have to go. It's been done before and it needs to be done again.
So if you want a vision laid out of what we've just been talking about, you can call in and get a copy of the CEC's Infrastructure Road to Development New Citizen, which has a whole heap of projects. But also, like I said, the specific details are in this week's Australian Alert Service. You can call in and ask for a free copy of that. Thanks for tuning into this week's CEC Report. Thanks, Craig.
You're welcome.
Come back next week for more.
been watching the CEC Report, the weekly TV show of the Citizens Electoral Council of Australia. What can people do to find out more, Robert?
Well, they can get on our website, www.cecaust.com.au, or they can call our toll-free number for Lisa to order a copy of this, the Australian Alert Service, which is our weekly publication where we write up all the material we use. That number is 1-800-636-432.